Good afternoon. My name is Nicolas Ferenczi. I represent the French cereal farmer organization. So I will talk from the point of view of European grain farmers. And I will start with the look back into the long term. And this is the real price evolution, past evolution, of wheat prices on the world market, namely on the Kansas City Board of Trade. I start from 1913 as compared to Mr. Agnotis, who started in 48, I think, and my predecessor who started in 50. So it's even older, but as you see, the trend is the same. It's the green, the red line, linearized. There is a very strong real-term decrease in prices of commodities generally and wheat in particular. And this is the first issue for farmers. This is not volatility, this is real prices, because competitiveness starts with being able to produce at a price which is lower than those decreasing real prices. And then, of course, the second step is volatility. And volatility, as you can see here, is not new, and you can even question whether it is any bigger those days than in the 70s or in the First World War, for example. So, volatility, in our view, is here to stay, and it's not new. And that's why I will focus on how to mitigate the impacts of volatility on the farm business. And I want to stress from the start that this is an issue not only about finding the right tools, but it's also an issue because managing your prices as a farmer takes a lot of time. And this time, of course, is taken away from your main business, which is production. So it's not necessarily a good idea to spend 50% of your time on price management, because you don't focus on production. So there is one limit of these coping strategies. There are more limits. I will talk about them later. And at the end of my talk, I will address very quickly the issue of limiting price volatility. This is a curve that you've already seen. This is just to show that volatility in Europe is relatively recent, in the sense that before the cap reform of '92, you will see this blue line, which is the intervention price. In other words, the minimum guaranteed price. This is wheat. And as you can see, in those times, basically, the price was relatively flat, volatility was low, and the European price was above the world price, which is this light black line, which is the FOB price of the US soft winter wheat. The red one is the European price, and you see that the guaranteed price has in the 90s decreased by steps, and at a certain level, around 95, the European price has reached the world price, and that has not changed since then. And in a first period before the years 2000, volatility remained low because the world volatility was low, and more recently, in the 2000s, then volatility has started to surge, and the same trend, of course, applies to farmers who have been forced only since the years 2000 to really put a lot of stress into managing their prices. So this table, don't try to go into every detail. That's just to describe the various marketing schemes in France for cereal farmers. How do they sell? Basically, they have quite a number of different possibilities, different options. Most of it is done through collectors, who basically collect 100% of what is marketed. This is the first two big lines, in fact, are the dominant one. Does it work? No, it doesn't. The first two big lines are the dominant schemes. The first one, which is the traditional one, which existed long before the years 2000, is what I would call the pool price contract. In other words, most of the cereal farmers, they used to sell to the collectors, and basically they delegated marketing of the grains to the collectors. And what did they do? The collectors, they were building an average price for the full season, and all the farmers, they used to receive the same price for the full season. And that was the traditional way, where basically it's the collectors who were coping with the market and with volatility. And that was a way, basically, of evening out the intra-annual volatility, the seasonal volatility for the farmers. More recently, in the years 2000, the second set of lines, which is called fixed price contract, that's the way we call it in France, has developed, and in certain years it covers up to 50% of all cereal deliveries in France. And this is a scheme whereby collectors are still in charge of many things. Contracts basically are between the farmers and the collectors, but there is a disconnection between the physical handling of the grains and the price setting. The physical handling is basically decided by the contract in advance, and the price setting, this is the farmer who decides what daily price he will choose for part of his crop. So basically, this has developed a lot, and what could be said about that? All these different schemes are various ways of hedging prices. In fact, they are more and more all based on underlying hedging on the financial markets, like futures and options. And this can be either directly by the farmers, but this is very rare. This can be through banks, but this is also quite uncommon. Most of these arrangements are basically through the collectors. In particular, it offers to the farmers a very interesting possibility, which is to share his risks, to sell some proportion of its future harvest well in advance at a time when he's making the decisions about how many hectares for what crop. So it allows farmers to more and more hedge their price risks. One of our key points about that is that these underlying financial markets, we need them. There are, of course, as everybody knows, regulations going on in Europe, and we are not against those regulations, of course, but we need to make sure that those financial markets continue to work properly in terms of hedging, which means continue with enough liquidity, enough convergence, because there is a big issue about convergence at settlement times for every month of contract. And that bureaucratic burden is not excessive, and we have some problems with the first one who has been implemented, which is the EMIR directive. Another important point is that, to our opinion, those financial markets are underdeveloped, and more precisely, when it comes to futures, there are not enough delivery points. For example, this is working perfectly well with West Europeans and especially French growers when it comes to wheat. But when it comes to the same wheat in Budapest, for example, you have a big problem because the delivery point is too far away, and this induces what is called a basis risk. That's about the delivery points. You have the problem with the commodities themselves, because a lot of commodities don't have a European futures market, or they have it, but it is underdeveloped and not significant. And this is the case for maize, this is the case for durum wheat, this is the case for barley. So there is this gap. And the third point is that you always hear about commodity markets, but another important point, because farmers deal not only with prices, they deal above all about their incomes, is the cost, and the cost has to do with input costs. And one of the very critical input costs is about nitrogen. They are the nitrogen fertilizers are highly volatile, and there is no futures market about nitrogen fertilizers. So that would be also highly needed. So that was about hedging, and I step to the next tool about mitigating volatility, which is farm insurance. As everybody knows, this is highly developed. This is now the dominant farm policy tool in the US. In Europe, it has developed slightly since 2002. In fact, it is very developed only in one country, which is Spain. It is slightly developed in a small number of countries, including France, the Netherlands, Poland, Italy. That's about it. And in the case of France, this is about 35% of all arable areas, so it's not negligible. It has been, in fact, pushed by cap subsidies since the reform of 2002. And we are reaching a peak there because subsidies are being basically put away from that type of funding. And that was about crop insurance or yield or production insurance. There is a second type of insurance, which is the key US one, which is revenue or gross margin insurance. And this one is simply not developed in Europe, and it won't until the end of the new cap, until 2020. For many reasons. One is that insurance companies don't want to go into that until they have a solution to those systemic risks, public reinsurance, enough subsidies, all the stuff, and budgets are not there in the current in the current cap. And moreover, those budgets would need to be extremely viable from year to year, because this type of policy is a counter-cyclical policy. In other words, when prices is low, insurance are being paid away to the farmers. And this, of course, requires very cyclical budgets. And as you know, or may know, the cap budget is basically the same every year. So we are fighting with that, unlike our American colleagues. The third tool I wanted to raise, and it is rarely accounted for in Europe, but in our view it is extremely interesting, it is the saving accounts. Basically, it means allowing farmers to put away, in good years, to put away some money from their current accounts into a reserve, and that money would be withdrawn back into the current accounts in the bad years, in the years where it is needed. This type of scheme works in Australia, for example. It works nominally in France, but it is completely underused. It is contemplated in countries like the UK or the US. And it offers quite a number of interesting points. It is generally subsidized, but the way it is subsidized is often through just the fact that you put money away from high taxation years and you put it back in low taxation years. So there is some subsidy into that taxation issue, but taxation issues are not EU, they are member state issues in Europe. So that's one of the reasons why things are not being correctly considered. But it has quite a number of very interesting points. First of all, it would allow maybe to cope with the current cap and to change it to something not fundamentally different, because it would basically transfer direct supports, which are the same every year, into a variable one without changing the supports. It would variabilize the support. When you see things from an American point of view, it has also a number of beauties, and there are quite a number of economists in the US who are thinking about that, because it seems to avoid some of the drawbacks of the income or revenue insurance in the US, like moral hazards, like the fact that the efficiency of the money is of course not optimal in an insurance scheme, because a lot of the money goes into the insurance companies and not in the farmers' pockets. So there are quite a number of interesting points with this, and what we are trying to push is that it is being studied and considered. So in summary, in fact, all those tools, and there are other ones, as you can see, I've put contra-cyclical direct supports in the last lines, and price safety nets, you know, these classical floor prices. These are all prices that would allow to cope with volatility. They have different effects. Not only they have different budgetary implications, efficiency implications, but they also don't address the same volatility. If you take price hedging, this addresses only seasonal volatility, basically what happens between sowing and harvesting. If you take insurance, this is interannual volatility, but it is not a protection against low prices because it is basically built on the average of the last few years. So when the trend is negative, basically the insurance is also getting down. So it's not a safety net, but it's an interannual protection. And of course, the only real safety nets are the last two ones, which are basically today still, I would say, completely completely out in Europe. They do exist, the intervention price does exist, but at the level of price which makes it ineffective. The interesting point with the new Farm Bill in the US is that they have put up again a new PLC scheme, as they call it, price loss coverage insurance, which is a way of assuring a minimum guaranteed price. So in fact, the Americans, they take care of that. So that's where we are with the tools to mitigate the impact of volatility. Now, what happens about volatility itself? Should we fight volatility? So again, I would state, first of all, that volatility is not new, that we need volatility. Otherwise, there is no way you can hedge. Excessive volatility is probably a problem, I would agree, but the problem is that nobody knows how to define excessive volatility. We also tend to believe, as some of the speakers before me have demonstrated, that market fundamentals are the key as opposed to financial speculation. And it's very clear, in fact, that attacking market fundamentals towards more equilibrium is probably the obvious way of limiting volatility. So supply, demand, and stocks. I'm sorry to say it may seem a bit simplistic, but volatility is the best weapon against volatility. In other words, if you let the farmers, first of all, if you let price fluctuations of the market reach the farmer. Secondly, if you let the farmer react, in other words, decrease production when the prices are low and increase production when the prices are high, you have probably done quite a part of the job. The problem is in that many countries, developing countries as well as developed countries, this is not as simple. And if I take the case of Europe, the best issue is, the key issue is not prices reaching the farmer. This is done correctly. But the best issue is allowing the farmer to increase their production whenever it is needed. And that is more and more made impossible to farmers. So that's probably, from a European point of view, one of the key tools against volatility. And more generally, what is the position of Europe and what can Europe do against global volatility? And here I would follow what Mr. von Witzke just said. Above all, if you take vegetal production, the EU is a major net grain and vegetal importer. In other words, the EU draws into the world resources. And this is in itself a factor of volatility. So if only Europe was just self-sufficient rather than a net importer, it would probably relieve some of the factors driving global volatility. Now, if you take a second dimension, this is even more convincing. If you take the question of the regularity of production between years. This is this small map in the bottom. I'm sorry it's not very visible. With a very simplistic calculation over the last 15 years, the result is that the viability of European production is in the region of 90%, 15%. Then comes the US, 22%, Canada, 26%, Argentina, 32%, Australia, 46%, and then you have Russia, 41%, Ukraine, 67%, and Kazakhstan, 73%. So forget about the figure. This is just to say that the climatic conditions in Europe make wheat production, this is in the example of wheat, but it is true for many other commodities, production much more even from year to year than in the rest of the world, basically. So more European production in proportion of the global production means more regularity, means less volatility. So that's one very obvious point to make. And as a conclusion, I would like to talk about the viable policy approaches, since this is one of the titles of this seminar. What conclusions can we draw in terms of policies and specifically the cap? The first column is the old cap. We had guaranteed prices. It has, of course, advantages. One of the key advantages is that farmers were rid of marketing. They didn't have to waste their time in marketing, or in pricing at least. So in fact, they were able to focus on production, and that may be one of the many reasons why productivity had a good growth rate at that stage. Of course, there were obvious drawbacks like no market signals, no proper reaction, exportation of volatilities from Europe to the rest of the world. So this is no more acceptable, full stop. Then we have had various reforms, and this is the second column, and today we are in a state of decoupled direct payments with some advantages. You both have an efficient support, even though it's not adapted year by year, and a good price signal, which in theory could allow farmers to respond to prices. But you have big drawbacks that probably make the current cap not sustainable in the long term, and this is about legitimacy. What sense does it make to give the same amount on every hectare to every farmer, and above all, every year, whereas some years it is needed and some years it's not. So it's probably not viable in the long term. Another, another issue is, of course, again, that farmers are spending quite a proportion of their time on pricing. So we are contemplating several ways. And if I look to the last column on the right-hand side, this is basically the US situation for a number of years. It used to be based on counter-cyclical payments. Now it is based on insurance payment, which are somehow another style of counter-cyclical payments. You have public money which goes in when in the years where the prices are low, or on the regions, on the productions which have a problem with low prices. Also with yields, of course. So it is a counter-cyclical scheme which for some reason is allowed by the WTO rules, whereas direct counter-cyclical payments are not allowed, but the mechanism is strictly the same, and the budget situation also is the same. You have very different budget expenditures from year to year. So it has, of course, a clear advantage, and many people those days in Europe are contemplating shifting the current cap into subsidizing insurances, and not only production or yield insurances, but also revenue insurances. But it has also quite a number of drawbacks, like a problem with market signals, a problem with the risk that the farmers would take under such systems, because of course they don't care so much about risks since they have this type of guarantee. And also an issue which makes it extremely difficult to imagine in Europe, which is the fact that we have the budgetary principles which more or less impose that the budget should be the same from year to year. So how can you organize something under such conditions? So not only the Americans, but also the Europeans should be maybe contemplating giving some space to the other scheme, which is the deposit or farm saving schemes, which may give some of the advantages of the various system, variabilization and input support in the years and in the conditions when they are needed, with quite limited disadvantages. One of the problem, and this is very obvious, is that we don't see today how it could be feasible, since this type of policies is not in the CAP, it is in the EU member states' decision-making scope. And this is one of the sad stories with Europe. You have certain policies, and whatever is not in the common policies is outside, and it doesn't move too quickly. So I think, as a conclusion, I would insist that the worst is what is being done today. The last CAP reform is renationalization. In short, it's a renationalization of the direct supports. I think we are going all the wrong way. What could be even worse in the next reform would be to drop everything, and it is one of the scenarios, because there is still a problem with legitimacy of the CAP. So I think we should, from now on, think on the next step and the next agricultural policy for Europe. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think we have heard from the four presenters. I think the first three focused on explaining exactly what is causing price volatility, but the last one looked at how to manage price and other production risks. So the floor is open for discussion.
Yes, my question is for the last speaker, Mr. Ferenczi. I got a little confused when you were speaking. On the one hand, you said that European farmers should not care about price and go back to production, but all businesses I know, they care both about production and manage prices. Why should farmers be any different? Number one. Number two, you talked about the fact that farmers like volatility because that, I think that's what you said. And I would like to ask you, is it true that the absence of volatility in European farming has actually made European farmers much more specialized and actually exposed more to volatility? In other words, to some extent, less diversified.
About the allocation of time, of course, you're right. The point with farming is not to avoid any time in price issues or marketing. Modern farming involves spending time on marketing. The point is that to the current situation in some of the people I know is that they are investing a very important proportion of their times into that activity, and it even has an influence on structures. In other words, you more and more find now farmers grouping one of them focusing 100% of his time into marketing. This is possibly a bit too much. I'm not saying that this is outside the scope or should be outside the scope of farming. About your second question, I'm not saying farmers like volatility. I'm just saying that in order to properly hedge their risks under the current condition, a minimum level of volatility is needed because you want counterparties on the financial markets. And if you want those counterparties to be present, to hedge your risk, to buy your futures contracts, you need some volatility, otherwise they won't be here. And anyway, that's one of the key issues with regulation of financial markets.
Thank you. Could you please, tell us your name and your institutional affiliation as well? Yeah.
Yes, my name is Wim Kloosterboer. I'm for the processing sector representative. I had more or less a remark on the counter-cyclical payments. I agree there with all the let's say the hazards it has in it. And next to that, I want to make the remark that in WTO, I think, Mr. Good can correct me, and the other experts here in the room, I think it's not allowed in WTO, but it's in the amber box, so it's in the let's say, the forbidden box. And the Americans have chosen for that. So that contributes to your argument, in fact, that it's not, let's say, that's a controversial measure, to put it mildly. And I think we have to be very prudent with that. And furthermore, I agree with you that the most simple one would be a deposit scheme, but frankly speaking, no one thinks of that in European at a European scale, because, yeah, it's national is tax, and so in Brussels they do not dare to discuss that. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, the last.
Yes, I have a question for the first two presenters. Both of you said that the price of energy, especially the price of crude oil, is one of the main drivers of the instability of agricultural prices. And at the same time, both of you said that mandates, biofuel mandates, don't play an important role, or even that they can be beneficial, if not for price stability, at least for uncertainty. So I feel a bit confused. Does this mean that you assume that biofuel mandates, biofuel, don't play a role in the transmission of prices from energy to agricultural commodities?
Thank you. There's a question here.
Julian Briz from Technical University of Madrid. My comment is to my colleague from University of Minnesota, Harold von Wieske. And I saw you, well, you made a prognosis on negative balance supply demand. I mean, that under the consumer point of view is a negative scenario. Well, yesterday morning at the Technical University of Madrid, we just celebrated the anniversary of Norman Borlaug. You know, he's also from University of Minnesota. He's the father of Green Revolution, and he was well, he was able just to feed 1,000 million persons, and the balance was the opposite. It was positive. That means that they said prices will go down because, well, on the use of the genetic engineering. And that is, my question is, did you consider in your analysis what is the role of innovation, genetic engineering? I know that this is a very controversial area, but still this is the situation. Yesterday was just the opposite. The prognosis was scientific that are in research of genetic engineering. What is your opinion about that?
Thank you. I think we will hear from the presenters first, and then we come back to you. Okay, thank you. Shall I start here?
Yes, the first question was about counter-cyclical payments. I was probably not clear enough. The point I was trying to make is that counter-cyclical payments, when it comes to direct payments, are, yes, banned under WTO rules. They are in the amber box. Whereas insurance schemes, publicly subsidized insurance schemes, which are another way of channeling counter-cyclical payments, are allowed under WTO rules, provided they respect a number of conditions, which is to have a minimum loss of 30%, and in the particular case of revenue insurance, to have to go for only 70% of the loss. If you respect those conditions, you are in the green box. The second question was about deposit schemes. Of course, you're right, but I'm not as pessimistic as you seem to be, in the sense that there are fights being done, there are now discussions being done, there are debates happening at national levels in Europe on deposit schemes. So, of course, this goes whatever. Nobody knows where it goes, but at least I can tell you that in the UK and in France, this is quite central in the discussions between farmers and their ministers of agriculture and of finance, of course.
Julian, I'm starting with your question First, you're completely correct. Productivity is a key issue and will become a key issue. According to our estimates, which are roughly in line with FAO statistics, or estimates, if I can remember it correctly, the demand for agricultural commodities or food will more than double between 2000 and 2050. And we can try to meet that rapid demand by either expanding the acreage or by producing more on the land that we already farm. The first option, expanding the acreage, as we learned today, isn't really available because the best land, the most productive land already is being farmed in many parts of the world, including Europe. There are no major land reserves left that could be used for farming, or where we do have such reserves, such as the tropical rainforest, we don't want to use that land for farming. So by our estimates, again, consistent roughly with FAO estimates, 90% of future production growth must come from productivity growth, and only 10% can be accounted for probably by expansion of the acreage. And then we have the funny thing, or the strange argumentation. In the past, we've argued the common agricultural policy acts to reduce world market prices of agricultural commodities that aggravates hunger and malnutrition in developing countries. And now we turn around and say, well, prices have gone up. Oh, this is really bad for the poor people in developing countries, because now they have to pay more for their food. So what's wrong with this picture? And of course, this has something to do with short-term versus long-term effects. In the short term, low prices help the poor because they have to spend less to buy food. But in the long term, we need higher prices to so farmers have an incentive to produce more and invest more. How do you get out of this dilemma? Obviously, by making farmers in poor countries more productive. And we know that hunger and malnutrition is most pronounced in areas in which farmers in developing countries have limited access to basic technologies such as improved seed, mineral fertilizer, or crop protection. So I think that would be the way to go. And I see you're pointing, but I want to briefly answer the other question. There are two effects. One is the cost effect. Between 20 and 40% of the variable cost of crop production are the result, directly or indirectly, the result of energy input. So if you have higher energy prices, you have higher cost in all other things being equal, translate into lower production. And then you have the biofuel effect, which is limited. So in our model, most of the price increase that is attributed to energy is the result of higher production cost.
Yeah, if I just may add, it's clear that the econometric and also the stochastic analysis has shown that the importance of the crude oil price, yeah, for the uncertainty. What I have shown, that was the somehow stabilizing effect of a mandate on the biofuel prices. Yeah? And since the effects in general are not very big, we cannot expect that there is also somehow a kind of transmission effect on cereal or oilseed markets.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think to the GMO question, I think one part of the research in our project is especially on GMOs. And really depending on how it goes, it can have a major impact, and especially on the costs. It's maybe not the biggest as the yield effect, but all the GMOs are often cost savings, often labor cost savings again. And this might have quite a downward impact on prices, as we have seen in quite a few cases. I think the relation between energy and agriculture is quite complex. I think Josef Smitover did a very nice paper at the FAO that it often puts a price floor and a ceiling in, and between it mitigates, but it really depends also on the volatility of the energy market. So it's a very complex. I think it's not a one-way relation.
Can I take care? Can you be as brief as you can, because we're running out of time? Yeah.
Gabriel Pons from Oxfam. This is a question for Mr. Ferenczi and perhaps for Mr. Van Mechel about price risk insurance for developing countries. We know that price risk insurance in poor countries is very difficult because financial markets are very narrow and the basis risk is huge. What do you think could be measures for controlling price risk in developing countries? I have been very interested in these saving accounts, Do you know any experience of saving accounts in developing countries, or what do you think could be better for a well-adapted tool for these conditions?
José María Sumsi, professor of the Technical University of Madrid, a member of the CEIGRAM. After 6 hours of presentations and discussions, I am very confused about the drivers on price volatility. Some presentations and models conclude that the main causes are outside of agriculture, let's say exchange rate, macroeconomic policies, etc. And others is saying that the market fundamentals are the main factors explaining price fluctuations. Someone could really clarify me on this question. Second is a very direct question for Ferenczi. What are the problems to move these policy measures like deposit schemes or crop insurance from a national policy to a common policy in Europe? It's a question of budget. And is it a question of budget? I would like to know your opinion about farmers and all those stakeholders in Europe. What would be the possibility to use part of the first pillar budget to put in place a common policy for deposit schemes or crop insurances? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll give now 1 minute to each presenter to respond to the questions.
About the price insurance in developing countries, I don't know of any experience, but maybe Mr. Galtier has some knowledge about that. About the question on how to move, why not moving insurance or deposit fiscal policies from national level to EU level. We are trying to convince to go that direction. The problem is that, as you know, we are not very much in a dynamic mood of European construction those days, you know, and getting more responsibilities into the hands of Brussels is not really the trend. If you take the fiscal example, there is still some progress going on by setting guidelines, you know, maximums, minimums, these type of things. But I suppose Mr. Haniotis is much better placed to give a response or a view about that.
Yeah. Is it now outside or inside agriculture? I think the answer is both. But one thing I think it's quite clear that the integration with the energy market is there, and it will go on, and it might be even bigger if we go to the future. So these, depending on the volatility of that market, it will influence the volatility inside agriculture. But we are not sure about, because then you enter in how volatile will be the energy markets. Because if somebody can say what the energy prices is really going to do, then you can earn a lot of money, because we all assume that the energy price will go much higher. But some specialists in that field are also not so sure about that one. We have the shale gas, but it might be one thing. It can be more things. You can do a lot of energy saving. So it's really key in that market also what's going on. On the other side, what are going the policies to do? Like in the bioeconomy, is it going on? We invest a lot. Because biofuels is maybe not a big impact, but biofuels is a little thing if you compare what's possible in bioenergy in total and biochemicals at all. So it's really depending, and and I think the macroeconomic influence of the financial markets, that's also it's penetrating in agriculture.
Yeah, Mary, maybe just 2 remarks. So first of all, the inputs in agriculture are increasing, so of course also then the macroeconomic side will have a bigger importance. I think that is a very clear relationship. that is explaining maybe why the oil price plays a bigger role. Then we have also the trade, which is increasing, and then exchange rate and other macroeconomic factors play another role. So I think there are good reasons why there is a kind of shift also to the macroeconomic indicators.
Yeah, with regard to the second question, Tassos, you may be the right person to answer, but we have plenty of political economic analysis suggesting that budgetary issues matter when it comes to common agricultural policy decisions. And we have this evidence not only for agricultural policy in Europe, but also for other countries. And to the colleague from the Technical University of Madrid, I at least hope you are confused on a much higher level than you were this morning. But I want to give you a serious answer. Speculators want to make money. Speculators can make money only if they predict future prices correctly. If they don't, they lose money and are quickly driven off the market. And that's the main underlying cause why speculation cannot really affect prices, neither in the long run nor with regard to fluctuations or volatility.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we had another great session, and I would like to thank the speakers for the interesting and informative presentation, as well as the audience for your active participation. I think we break for coffee now, and thanks a lot.